And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Good evening, resistors. Today is October 17th, 2011, and the word is occupation. Resistance Radio, hot off the heels of the first day and night, very cold night in fact, of Occupy London. It was great to meet everyone and to catch up with those who I've met before at other protests. And I think overall it was a positive experience. I definitely think as things move on, they might perhaps have to reevaluate the whole megaphone repeating system that was going on. I mean, what stage are we at? Are we really at the stage of a full-blown occupation? Or, as I think we saw, are we still looking to share ideas and nail down the problems and the root causes? To me, it all seemed a bit disjointed. I personally still think we need to be canvassing the streets and handing out leaflets and educating the wider public. If we're still not unified, which I think we're clearly not, by the vast array of ideologies and worldviews that were there, maybe something less dramatic should be organised. You know, what use is occupying an area until demands are met, when nobody agrees on the causes of the problems and nobody agrees on the solutions? It's that indecisiveness that can give rise to the co-opting by established groups and charismatic leaders like Julian Assange and things like that. So it was definitely a start. You know, it's early days. It was great to see everybody willing to take to the streets for the perceived injustices in the world, and I think things can only grow from here. But it wasn't the most practical setup. I mean, it may be better to hold some kind of festival style gathering where we can have proper microphones and sound systems and people can set up booths and workshops to express their views and ideas. Because it just struck me that we may be putting the cart before the horse, reacting, creating that revolutionary atmosphere without really any kind of deep analysis or discussions on causes and solutions. Repeating short sentences to each other is not going to help the movement progress. I think we may have jumped the gun a little bit. But if you want to check out some of my thoughts and footage, go to youtube.com/wideshut.co.uk. But switching gears, we're now joined on the line by Tom Secker. Tom is an independent researcher and filmmaker and recently released his second film, 7/7 Crime and Prejudice, again on the topic of the London bombings. You can watch that film for free online on the 7/7 Archive YouTube channel. But welcome back to the show, Tom.
Hi, Keelan. It's good to be back. Good to be talking to you again.
Cool. Now, you've called the new film 7/7 Crime and Prejudice. Tell us about the new approach, what your goal was in looking at these historical inquiries and investigations, and how did that bear relation to 7/7? Because I think you've brought a whole new historical context to the debate. So just give us an overview of that.
Okay, I mean, the difference in title is because in the first film I was mainly looking at the question of 7/7 in terms of the history of covert ops, of black ops. So that was the historical context I kind of, put at the start of the film as a kind of introduction and as a provocation, if you like, a context, a subtext, and all of that to then look at the various questions about 7/7 as they stood then, which was early last year. Before that. Whereas in the new film, I was specifically looking at criminal investigations of allegations of black ops and covert ops. So, for example, you have the collusion in Northern Ireland. You have this situation whereby the British Army, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, effectively the British police there, and of course MI5, MI6, all of whom had connections to both the Loyalist and the Republican paramilitary factions of this conflict,
Yeah.
and in many ways protected them and prevented, proper police inquiries into various murders and terrorist attacks as they happened, from the 60s through to virtually the present day, and possibly still going on now. And there have been several pretty major inquiries into the issue of collusion. Obviously been widely criticised. Obviously, to some extent, they were grey washes, or at least were obstructed inquiries. People wouldn't talk to them. MI5 withheld documents from them. All the rest of it.
Yeah.
So they've, it's recognised now that collusion is a reality, but the exact way in which it impacted on specific events, specific murders, specific bombings, is still, relatively unclear. And as a result, very few prosecutions have come from this. So the context in which I was sort of discussing 7/7 would be, I suppose the overall question is, how well does the justice system, the policing and justice system in Britain, deal with the fallout from covert operations? And the short answer to that is very badly. And so if 7/7 was some kind of covert operation, then how can we sort of look at the way that the inquests took place, which is, of course, a judicial proceeding, an inquest? What light does that shed on the way in which the inquests happened, and what did and didn't get asked at the inquests, and what did and didn't get answered at the inquests?
Well,
So that was...
I think it was a fairly good approach that you took there, and I was particularly interested in the whole Irish Troubles section of the film, because I've done some glancing research at the Omagh bombings and so on, and there does seem to be that underlying complicity from the British agents, and there was obviously a lot of injustice there. One case you do go into is the Guildford pub bombings. Give us an overview on that. What went down there?
Well, these were in the mid-1970s. This is after the Northern Irish conflict really kind of spiraled out of control in the 1960s. Up until then, there was still a kind of diplomatic route that was going on, a kind of peaceful political struggle for independence that was going on. But in the 60s, in the late 60s, much as it did in Italy and any number of other countries you care to look at, terrorism took hold. It became a very kind of almost a commonplace means for these revolutionaries and these independence fighters and all the rest of it to try and, force their political aims.
Yeah.
The Guildford and Woolwich pub bombings were in 1973, 1974, I'm not sure. And these were basically someone chucked handheld bombs into two pubs. They killed several people. They wounded quite a lot of people. These were just relatively indiscriminate attacks, although the reasons why those particular pubs were targeted was because they were known as kind of hangouts for British soldiers in the area, in those particular sort of areas of London. So they were targeted at the British state, at the British military, but they were kind of indiscriminately also targeted at the general public who just happened to be in there having a pint.
Yeah.
So within a matter of weeks after these bombings took place, they arrested the Guildford Four, who were four young, highly sort of susceptible people, people who didn't have much money, people who, maybe had got mixed up with drugs or other petty crime, and therefore were vulnerable. They were vulnerable to the police basically pinning this crime, these horrible crimes, pinning them on these four people. And they also arrested the Maguire Seven, who were a group of people who had allegedly handled explosives for the IRA that were somehow connected with these bombings. So all 11 of these people were completely innocent. They had nothing to do with these crimes, yet all 11 spent over a decade in prison because of it, apart from one of them who died in prison. So I suppose what you have there is a very real terrorist group, a unit of the Irish Republican Army, a unit of the IRA called the Balcombe Street Gang. Now, these were some very serious terrorists. They were not, in any way trivial terrorists. They were serial killers. They were horrendous criminals. And for around a year, they were running around London, carrying out assassinations, carrying out bombings, killing lots and lots of people, injuring lots and lots of people. But crucially, and I think there is a lesson in this, they were brought to trial ultimately, at least for some of these crimes. They ended up being sort of chased down by Special Branch and by the police in London, and they took a couple of hostages in a flat in Balcombe Street. That's why they're known as the Balcombe Street Gang. And they held these hostages for several days, and eventually the police and the negotiators managed to talk them down, managed to talk them out. And you'll remember in the film there's a clip of people coming out onto the balcony with their hands behind their head, and that is the sort of the footage of when this terrorist gang sort of finally gave themselves up. Now, at their trial in 1977, I think it was, they admitted that they were responsible for these pub bombings in Guildford and in Woolwich, and that the Guildford Four were completely innocent. So this was on the record in 1977, but it was another, 10, 12 years before the Guildford Four were released.
Why do you think they got it so wrong? Was it a case of they just wanted to appease the public quickly and get these people sent down, and even if it was the wrong people, obviously that's a bad thing to do, or do you think there was something more behind the whole bodged case against them?
I think it probably was that. I mean, collusion was a reality, very much so. There were a lot of informants and MI5 agents and FBI and all the rest of it within both the Irish Republican militant movement and the Loyalist paramilitary movements. And so I think it's probably a case of there was so much kind of public outrage over these terrorist atrocities that the police kind of had to be seen to be reacting. They had to be seen to be solving the crimes, because otherwise they'd have to admit that in reality there's not much you can do if a group of very hard lads decide to start blowing things up and shooting people. And I think the sad reality of it is there isn't an awful lot you can do. You can just try and catch them as quickly as possible. But instead of actually catching the people who did it, they came up with these four people who had nothing to do with it, who had their lives ruined by the police and the prosecution service. I mean, it's the whole justice system really that did this. So I'm open to the possibility that there's more going on in that story, and that there may be further reasons why the wrong people went to prison for those attacks. But I haven't really seen evidence of that. So for the time being, at least, I think this was just a case of the police feeling they had to be seen to react, and reacting in a very stupid way.
In the film, you also touched on a more recent kind of miscarriage of justice in the story of Muhammad Hamid, which is just another one of those head scratchers. You sometimes hear these cases where somebody's been arrested for terrorism because they had a video that they downloaded or something, or people in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's all overhyped and they get arrested under these terrorism charges. Why don't you tell us a bit about the Hamid case, because it is quite a head scratcher.
Well, I mean, this is the case of a guy, Muhammad Hamid, and several others who were prosecuted and ultimately convicted and sent to prison for incitement to murder and for attending or receiving terrorism training. They were either being charged with running the camps or going to the camps to get trained in terrorism. But these terrorism training camps were a nonsense. I mean, they were just camping trips, essentially. There were a bunch of, men in their, 30s and 40s, I'm not quite sure how old they were, sort of going off and playing in the woods. I mean, this is the sort of thing that men of every culture, of every religion, of every race have, done for a very long time. You go off into the woods with a bunch of the lads and you go and frolic around in the woods a bit. I mean, it's completely harmless. And I'm sure if I went out and did it, absolutely nothing would happen to me. But
and the TV were even filming him for like some documentary or something, is that right?
Well, one of the trips was the BBC were making a very earnest, completely honest documentary called Don't Panic, I'm Islamic, which broadcast in 2005. And one of the people that they'd filmed in the making of this documentary was Muhammad Hamid. and they'd interviewed him, and okay, the guy has a slightly strange sense of humour. Even I find it strange.
Yeah.
But he's harmless, He's just got some rather funny ideas about the world. And so the BBC paid for him and some of these other friends to go off paintballing. And they filmed them running around with the paintball guns and all the kit on, and having a time paintballing in the woods.
Was that ever aired?
Yeah, the documentary's aired. I mean, you can find it on YouTube.
So was their angle just sort of like, these are just normal Islamic people having fun?
Yeah, very
Okay.
much so. That was how it was presented in the documentary. That was the aim of the documentary, was to sort of say that, okay, some British Muslims might have a few strange opinions and maybe dress a bit differently to the rest of us, but, so what? They're still just human beings who do what human beings do. I think the documentary was very honest in that respect. I don't think in any way they were sort of trying to set the guy up. But nonetheless, at the trial, the prosecution used footage that was shot as part of that documentary of this paintballing trip, and tried to make out this was another one of Hamid's paramilitary terrorism training camps. And it was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, one of the producers of the show, a guy called Phil Reese, who he also made At Home with the Terror Suspects, and he now works for Al Jazeera. And he appeared as a defence witness at Hamid's trial and said, there's nothing going on here. This is just a bunch of blokes going paintballing. It's got absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. So even the guy who made the film who was sort of saying this in interviews after the trial, and still somehow the prosecution got a conviction out of that trial, and it baffles me. It really does, as to quite how they did manage to get a conviction, because you look at these mobile phone videos of these guys out in the woods, jumping over rivers and playing with sticks.
They're not exactly professionals or anything, are they?
Well, that's the thing. If these guys even were terrorists, even if they had that kind of motivation and that kind of view of the world that might drive them to that, they'd be completely bloody useless terrorists, because they didn't have any weapons, they didn't have any explosives, they didn't have any military training. They were just sort of messing around. So yeah, it's a very, very strange case, and a very worrying case, because, like I say, if I did this, chances are I'd be fine. But you can imagine a scenario a few years down the line when it's not just the Irish, or it's not just Muslims that they're targeting as part of their war on terror, and it could expand to being people who are against the Iraq War and against the war in Libya.
Well, what always worries me when I'm going through a few bits of paranoia or whatever is that we look into these things, we download documents and videos and things. I mean, they could easily just say, oh, he's got all this stuff on his computer, blah blah blah. I mean,
absolutely. And there's another case in the film with Khalid Khalik, who was basically charged with this rather kind of ambiguous and vague charge of possessing a document that could be useful for terrorism purposes. And he ended up pleading guilty. I'm not quite sure why he pled guilty. I imagine his lawyers advised him to. But basically, he was a friend of the alleged 7/7 bombers, or at least a friend of a couple of them. He was involved at the Iqra bookshop up in Leeds, around which so much of this story kind of revolves. And he had a CD in a box in his attic that was found by the police when they raided his house after 7/7. And on it they found, among other things, a copy of the so-called Al-Qaeda training manual. Now this is a document that, of course, I have several copies of, because there are actually several different editions of this. So, theoretically, I am in possession of a document that could be useful for terrorism purposes. Now, obviously, I don't have it for that. I have it because I'm interested in this stuff, because I'm a researcher and a filmmaker. But this guy, Khalid Khalik, didn't, as far as we know, download this file. He didn't burn it to the CD, and he didn't actually put it in his attic. He had nothing really to do with it. But because he sort of couldn't prove that it wasn't in his possession, and because it was found in his house, he was, he ended up being sent to prison for this. And it's utterly ridiculous, because it is just a widely available document. You could, I don't think you still can, download it from the US Justice Department's website. And I think the version that he was found in his house was actually that version. So that's particularly strange. That you could potentially go to prison for downloading something from the Justice Department.
Yeah.
But the real kind of horrible twist in the background of this story is that manual was actually written by a double agent, by
Right. Yeah.
a guy called Ali Muhammad, who was working for the CIA for a while, and he was in the US Special Forces, and he was involved in the war in Afghanistan and all of this. So it is effectively a product of a covert operation. So going back to the original question, how does the justice system respond to the fallout from covert operations? Very badly. And I think Khalid Khalik is a serious victim of that, because all he's really done is been found with a CD with a PDF file on it.
It's a shame lawyers don't really reach out to these people, because I mean, I'm sure it would be fairly simple to get them off these kind of cases, but do you think it's maybe a case of they're deliberately advising them wrong, or?
I think it's, in a lot of cases, these lawyers aren't particularly well paid. I mean, most of these cases are fought by very poor people.
Oh yeah, I suppose, yeah.
So they don't have a lot of money. They don't necessarily have a lot of, unless you've got a lawyer who really, really believes in you and is going to do a lot of work that's essentially unpaid, then a lot of them aren't going to do the background for this. I mean, where that manual came from was never really, as far as I can tell, was never really a question asked at their trial. The fact that, who wrote it and where and when and why was never really kind of introduced into evidence. And I can only assume if his defense lawyers had known about that they would have brought it up. But they probably didn't know about it because, like I say, they probably just didn't have the resources to do a proper job on that defense.
Yeah, I've just pulled something up here going back to Muhammad Hamid, and supposedly he was skeptical of the official 9/11 and 7/7 stories, and possibly handed out DVDs and stuff. So I mean, just to make a simple point there, why would somebody skeptical of these official stories, who was no doubt wary of the security services anyway, why would he then be involved in terrorism? It's almost like a cognitive dissonance that he would be going through there.
Well, yeah, and I mean, on the Hamid thing, I will recommend looking up the Free Muhammad Hamid campaign. It's a blog with videos, and it's got the bit out of my film on it, and it's got some documents from the case, and I think they've just started a discussion forum as well. So it's a very interesting and a very horrible case. So by all means, go there and look at that. Yes, as far as we know, Hamid was and still is skeptical about 9/11 and 7/7, or the official versions of those events. And you're right, it doesn't make much sense that a guy like that would be then become involved in terrorism, become involved in something that he apparently doesn't really believe exists, this, global fanatic Islamic terrorist network. But also, why would he do it so overtly?
Right.
I mean, who does terrorism training like that? Who goes off and films themselves doing
Yeah,
it?
well, who would let the
mobile
BBC
phones?
film them? Like,
Yeah, yeah, it would just be madness for this guy to be doing this. So the case doesn't make any sense at all. And as far as I'm concerned, the guy's completely free, completely innocent, and should be freed. I can't see that he's really guilty of anything.
And it says here on his Wikipedia page, citing a Der Spiegel article, that he was somehow connected to Anwar al-Awlaki, and of course he recently, or supposedly recently, was blown up in Yemen, I believe, or something for a drone strike. What's your take on the whole al-Awlaki situation, and how he dined at the Pentagon and was US born and kind of became this leading, almost patsy figure, kind of involved in all these other plots that never really got anywhere, but certainly allowed the US to further their police state measures?
Well, I think I broadly agree with you. I think Awlaki has the hallmarks of being another double agent of some sort, or at least a figure who is monitored by the intelligence agencies for as long as he does things that are useful to them. He may not have actually been working for them. He may not have actually been working for military intelligence when he went and had dinner at the Pentagon after 9/11, but he did go and do that, and obviously that is a rather strange thing for any sort of Islamic fundamentalist to be doing at any point in history, let alone a couple of months after 9/11. My whole take on al-Awlaki is that I suppose he's supposed to be one of the bigwigs in this group, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, ACAP or AQAP, however you pronounce it, who don't seem to really exist. They don't.
But they've got this magazine that like gets published in English-speaking countries and stuff. But yeah.
Well, and it has absolutely. I mean, have you ever read that magazine? It has absolutely stunning production values.
Yeah.
I struggle to see how, for people for whom English is not their first language, or even if it is, people who don't have, professional design skills and everything would be putting together a magazine that looks so beautiful and is so kind of wonderfully laid out. And obviously the suspicion there is that it has absolutely nothing to do with these people and they're not actually publishing it, and someone else, CIA or whoever, is publishing it for propaganda purposes. And this whole group, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, solely seems to exist for the purpose of fueling war on terror propaganda. They've never, as far as I can tell, published any proper kind of manifesto of political aims or made any real statements as to what the hell it is they're actually trying to accomplish. Yet every once in a while they turn up with, some idiot who tries to set fire to his underwear on a plane, or, another issue of this wonderful looking magazine, or whatever else it is that is needed so that they can have a war on terror story that week.
And of course they recently supposedly came out in this magazine and said President Ahmadinejad is a big bad conspiracy theorist for, questioning 9/11. But, last year they were saying bin Laden was being hidden by Ahmadinejad in the mainstream media. So they even contradict themselves on all the propaganda that they kind of push out.
Yes, it's very, very muddy waters. So I'm not certain exactly what's going on here. I am sort of guessing to some extent that they are some kind of phony patsy network. But they certainly don't seem to be a real terrorist network, because if they were, then I'm pretty sure they would have accomplished something more by now. Because to be honest, it's not that physically difficult to carry out a terrorist attack, yet bizarrely, the one really big one that they were supposedly behind, the underpants bomber, failed miserably. So if that was intended as a serious terrorist attack, then it was a miserable failure.
And the underpants bomber trial, I believe, is starting or is about to start, and the guy wants to represent himself. So, I mean, they're going to run circles around him.
Well, the guy himself, he doesn't come across as being particularly bright, does he? No. He's another one of these people who is clearly a kind of vulnerable individual who has somehow been co-opted or recruited into this. As to representing himself at the trial, well, Ramzi Youssef, the World Trade Center bomber, did try that one, and it didn't work very well. He ended up being given a 240-year prison sentence, and he's now sat in a maximum security prison cell, and he's barely allowed to do anything. And that's probably what's going to happen to Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab. He's going to end up being found guilty for this. I can't really see how why he's not pleading guilty, to be honest, because the evidence against him, at least trying to do something on that plane, exactly what he was trying to do and why, I'm not sure. The evidence seems to be pretty, cut and dried. He was on that plane, he did try and set fire to his trousers or whatever. I suppose it depends on the nature of the charges as to why he's not pleading guilty. But yes, that trial is, I don't think it's actually started in terms of holding witnesses and cross-examinations yet, but it's gearing up, it's about to happen. And it will be something very, very much worth following, because one of the things I've found in the course of all this research is that actually some of the most important evidence and some of the strongest, most kind of strongly founded evidence does come out in the judicial proceedings. All the stuff about Muhammad Junaid Babar. The reason why we know about Muhammad Junaid Babar is because the records of his trial are largely available on the internet, and the parts that aren't available on the internet have been quite well reported on. I mean, it's one of the few things that the mainstream media has actually sort of got right to some extent. And so, in terms of trying to unravel this network of deception and covert operations and double agents and trying to figure out exactly what is going on in the war on terror, I think the judicial proceedings are often the most revelatory. And so it's very much something people should keep an eye on and try and learn about.
Yeah, it's definitely something I think everyone should keep their eye on. We've had Kurt Haskell on Resistance Radio several months back, and hopefully we'll probably get him on again, because I know he's obviously going to be following it closely as well. So we'll see how that goes. But switching gears, in your film you also explore the possibility of maybe a fifth bomber or a wider network involved with the whole attack on 7/7. Of course, there was the lady who witnessed things at the alleged bomb factory, and then the mysterious Jaguar and stuff. Go over some of that and the idea that there was other men involved that haven't really been followed up on.
Well, I mean, if you may have or may not have noticed this in the film, but I put that section immediately after the section on the trial of 3 men who were accused of being co-conspirators in the 7/7 plot. Now, they were ultimately acquitted. At the first trial, the jury couldn't come to a verdict. At the second trial, they were acquitted. And the evidence against them was about as shockingly poor as the evidence against Muhammad Hamid. I mean, it was a joke trial, or it would be a joke trial if it didn't have such grim consequences for people. But so the question of, was there a wider plot? Were there more than those 4 men involved? Assuming those 4 men were involved, were there more men involved or more people involved in this conspiracy to cause these terrorist attacks? It's a fundamental question, and it's one on which the authorities have kind of jumped backwards and forwards. They sort of, when it suits them, they say, oh, they were just homegrown, they were self-radicalized, they were working on their own. And yet then they changed their mind and said, oh no, these 3 other guys, they were very much involved in the plot. They were part of this big conspiracy. And then when those guys were found innocent, they've sort of gone back to the whole, oh no, they were homegrown, they were just working on their own idea again. But yeah, on the morning of 7/7, you have 3 of the guys travelling down from Leeds to Luton Station, where they meet up with the 4th guy, and then they all travel to London. And at each stage, in Leeds, at the supposed bomb factory, in Luton Station, in the car park, and in London, at King's Cross, you have eyewitnesses that say there were as many as 2 or 3 extra people at each point than there should have been if the official narrative is actually true. There were people saying, there were 5 or 6 men loading rucksacks into the back of a car outside of the bomb factory. And then that 2 different cars drove off, and one of them had 4 men in and one of them had 1 or 2 men in. So there should only be 1 car driving away from that bomb factory, supposed bomb factory, and it should only have 3 people in it. There shouldn't be 2 cars with 4 in one and 2 in the other. So who are these extra people, and where is that extra car? Same sort of story when they get to Luton Station. You have another witness called Sue Clark, who is on the CCTV. You can see her coming in at the time that she says she came in and behaving in the exact same way as she outlined in her statements to the police. It's all on the CCTV. And she says that sort of when she passed by these cars in Luton Station car park and sort of glanced in, that she thought there were as many as 5 or 6 men in Luton Station car park, when again there should only be 4. By the time they get to London, they are supposedly seen by Joseph Martocchia, a businessman who was on the tube in London, and his statement comes out in the Home Office narrative. This idea that the men were seen hugging, having a sort of group hug, a euphoric group hug in the moments before they split up and go on their suicide mission. But the problem with Martocchia's statement is, firstly, he only recognised, and in pretty vague terms, recognised 2 of them. He didn't recognise the other 2. He also said that there were as many as 5 or 6 men, again, 1 or 2 extra people, and he said that he thought they were some kind of sports team. He very much, his statements don't really fit with the notion that these were suicide bombers, that these were fanatics on a terrorist mission. So there are issues, admittedly, with all of this testimony, and they could all be wrong, but when one of the key witnesses whose account is in the Home Office narrative as part of this story about suicide bombers is in fact saying, well, I could only recognise 2 of them at best, and there were at least 1 or if not 2 extra people alongside them, then you've got to ask, what is this narrative? Is it just a kind of cherry picking of details from sprinklings of newspaper
there's
reports?
so many different leads and things you can go on, and they just seem to box it into their own kind of view that I guess they'd already developed before writing it, I guess, with their prejudices, so to speak.
Exactly. And I mean, this is partly why I call it Crime and Prejudice, is because ultimately this was a crime. I mean, it was an act of mass murder. It was something that was exploited both domestically and internationally. It was many other things as well. But at sort of rock bottom, it was a crime. It was an act of murder against those people. And any crime should be investigated without an a priori prejudice as to who was responsible, and that just doesn't seem to have taken place in this instance. And throughout the inquests, every time that there was any kind of issue with the evidence that the police were presenting, and there were all sorts of issues, and if you go on the July 7th Truth Campaign's blog, they've documented, dozens of instances at these inquests where, either questions weren't asked or they sort of were asked, but the police or security services just refused to answer them. So we've got to ask, what actually happened in this police investigation? Was there even a proper police investigation, or were they kind of just given a story and then everything else was just made to fit in around it?
And one thing that's never really satisfied me is the whole forensics of it all, or lack thereof. Lots of shifting stories, lots of contradictions. And what always intrigued me was that we never saw clear images and video of the immediate blast areas. We've had eyewitnesses saying various things. Obviously, Bruce Late was something a lot of people brought up, because he said, under the carriages possibly. That's open to interpretation, I think. But I think your film quite clearly showed that the official story of where the blasts were is not clear at all. Maybe you could go into that a bit.
Okay, I mean, this is a relatively complex argument, but I'll try and give you it quickly. The basics of it is that the Home Office narrative gives locations for 3 of the alleged bombers, and says that all of them took off their rucksacks containing their bombs, put the rucksacks on the floor, and blew themselves up and killed those people, and destroyed these train carriages. But the problem is the Metropolitan Police entered into evidence at the inquests a series of diagrams which do not, for the most part, correspond with where the Home Office narrative says these explosions took place. So to even talk of an official story as to where the explosions, exactly where in the carriages the explosions happened, is a bit of a falsehood, because there isn't an official story. There are claims made by the Home Office, and there are a series of diagrams released by the Metropolitan Police that don't match up with those. And so to try and make sense of this, in the film, I sort of went through various witness statements, and in particular hand-drawn diagrams by witnesses who were on the scenes. They were either in the next carriage or they arrived on the scene shortly afterwards, and they drew the damage that they found and that they saw. And in almost every case, it does not correspond to what the Home Office narrative says, and in most cases it doesn't correspond to the police diagrams either. So you have this issue of multiple holes being blown in the floor by a single explosive device. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And so I suppose a little bit of guesswork here. We are maybe looking at a very different kind of scenario to people actually carrying bombs on their person, to a possible scenario of bombs being not just left on the carriages, but sort of built into them beforehand. Because I'm guessing, but that's the only kind of explanation I can come up with that would actually make sense of all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a major point that if we were going to get some kind of reinvestigation, that would be one of the biggest points to make. That look, you guys aren't even clear where the bombs were. I mean, let's go back to the drawing board and look at this properly. But I guess all the evidence now is kind of not there anymore. So
Well, not necessarily. They destroyed the carriages. Okay. Those tube carriages in which bombs apparently went off have all been scrapped, and the other ones that were damaged were all repaired. But there is, just for example, presumably paperwork relating to the repairs that were made on those carriages. That might give us some clues. There are presumably crime scene photos and video from inside these carriages. I mean, they released these tiny little clips at the inquests, but they didn't add up to very much, and they certainly didn't show us anything important. But the rest of that video presumably still exists somewhere. So, without kind of getting it too much into a conspiracy theory, I suppose all of that stuff could be faked or could be edited or could be manipulated. But still, that would be where a proper investigation would try and get these answers. If we can't use the physical evidence, we can at least use records relating to the physical evidence to try and fit all this together. And if the best thing we can come up with is a kind of on the balance of probabilities conclusion, then maybe that is the best we can come up with. But given the amount of evidence that presumably still exists somewhere that we haven't seen yet, I think there is very much somewhere to go with this, somewhere to go with the 7/7 investigation.
yeah, absolutely. And we've not got much time left here today, but another thing I wanted to touch on, something kind of new I think you've brought to the table. You looked at lots of episodes of Spooks and different kind of TV shows and things. And for those that don't know, Spooks is a TV drama over here based on MI5 and all that kind of thing. And there's kind of the implication there that these TV shows and things may have helped shape people's opinions of terrorism and 7/7.
Well, I mean, we've got to assume that to some extent that was always going to be the case. I mean, if the state broadcaster in Britain makes a drama show about the state intelligence agencies, one can only assume there's going to be some propaganda in there. But specifically with regards to 7/7, what I did, or at least tried to do, was I went back to this case of supposedly Britain's first suicide bomber, which is way back in the 1890s, a French anarchist who blew himself up in Greenwich Park. And his inquest concluded a verdict of suicide, but there is very little evidence that it was a suicide, and quite a lot of evidence that the guy intended to survive, intended to still be alive at the end of the day. So what happened after his death? This guy's called Marshal Bourdain. What happened after Bourdain's death was a series of speculations and conspiracy theories and different interpretations of what could have happened, whether this guy knew he was carrying a bomb or didn't, whether he intended to set it off or didn't, whether it went off by accident, whether he was somehow set up or duped. All of these things kind of came out in the 10 or 15 years after his death. They were then fictionalized in a novel and in an Alfred Hitchcock film. The Hitchcock film in particular is quite prescient with regards to 7/7. And so what I was trying to do was use that as a foundation for understanding what happened around 7/7. And again, what we have is a kind of melange of conspiracy theories and of different kind of speculative notions of how this could have really gone down, being presented to us, the public, through these television programs, even in the years before 7/7. And this doesn't just apply to the official narrative of Muslim suicide bombers, it also applies to some of the alternative narratives about training exercises and suicide bomber patsies and things like this. And I mean, if you can go on my blog to get a list of all of the different episodes and films and things and exercises and simulations and what have you that I looked at. So you can go and watch all of these episodes yourself and sort of draw your own conclusion as to whether you think this was part of some kind of intentional preconditioning, a sort of cultural programming that was going on beforehand and afterwards. I'm not sure. I can't say for certain that it was, and so I'm not saying for certain that it was. But I think it's something people should bear in mind, again, is that we aren't just propagandized through news media, through factual programming. We are also propagandized through fiction, through the simulation of reality, through, we are given values, we are given ideas, these little memes about different certain events that either could still be, still to happen in the future or may have happened in the past. All of this kind of is woven together as part of the propaganda about the war on terror.
Well, it's the same sort of thing when you go back to all the old war propaganda. I mean, the medium of film has always been used to portray, the state's kind of, or the establishment kind of line of things.
Well, very much so. If you look at, the old John Wayne films, World War II films, where John Wayne always saves the world, and things like this. But also, you might look at cop shows, which are a development out of the old Cowboys and Indians shows, and also out of cop shows where you have the goodies and the baddies, and the goodies always win because they're the goodies. And out of that, we've also now got the spy drama. You've got things like, Mission Impossible started back in the 60s, and so did the Bond films. And Spooks is just a sort of continuation or a development out of that. And as I said in the beginning, you've always got to assume that if a state broadcaster is making a film about a state institution, there will be some propaganda in there. But what I'm sort of trying to explore and trying to figure out is whether they are presenting us with an argument between conspiracy theories about an event before that event actually happened, so that once it happened, people would either identify with the official story or would identify with one of these particular conspiracy theories, the unofficial stories, rather than just investigate, see where the evidence takes you, and try and figure it out.
Well, there are these kind of inklings that hint at that kind of thing going on. I mean, former MI5 agent Annie Michon has brought up a few times this program called IOPS, Information Operations, that can plant news stories and things like that. We've had news stories of MI5 kind of monitoring BBC staff and things like that. And you talked about this on the James Corbett interview, which was very interesting. The Lone Gunman episode was brought up about which kind of predicts 9/11. And I'm pretty sure, I'll have to do some more Googling, but pretty sure one of the actors came out and said that, it's quite common for CIA type or government figures to kind of offer ideas at Hollywood parties and things like that. So there are these leads that we could look into and hopefully get more details on.
Well, and I think understanding the propaganda war, because of the lack of physical evidence about 7/7, the propaganda issue, the issue of preconditioning or post-conditioning after the event, the whole question of how it is that this official story became established, that may be the best line of inquiry for us, because in the absence of hard physical evidence that you can just look at and it is what it is, maybe that's where this is headed, and maybe that's where we should go with this. I mean, I support virtually all avenues of investigation into 7/7. I think looking at just about every angle is worthwhile. But that is one that I am particularly focused on, partly because it's not really been looked at in that much detail beforehand. There is some stuff on the July 7th Truth Campaign's forum, which is where I got a few of the sort of starting points for this story. And then when I looked into it some more and compiled footage and read a few more papers and things, I kind of fleshed it out a bit. But it isn't something that many people have looked at, either with regard to 9/11 or with regard to 7/7. And there is potentially some really kind of important evidence in there. So, that's an angle. Like I say, I support many different angles of inquiry, but that's one I am particularly interested in, though I'm not quite sure where we go with it.
And I think a good thing you've demonstrated is that, there are all these leads and we should follow them, but don't get caught up in saying, right, this happened like this, it was predicted in this film. It's about the information. It's not about saying exactly what happened, because we don't know. That's just the nature of these kind of events, because there is no transparency within intelligence agencies and whatnot. So it's important to look at these things, but don't pretend like you know exactly what happened. I think you've brought a level-headed approach to that kind of research.
Well, I've tried to, and of course, this going back to this whole thing about episodes of Spooks and whatnot, is that I think there is a very real possibility in this that we've been deliberately presented, with red herrings, with cul-de-sacs, with leads that don't really go anywhere, things that were kind of set up as distractions, maybe. I'm not certain that this is the case by any means, but I think it is a possibility that all investigators, regardless of what you're investigating, should be mindful of. And I do wonder about things like the Peter Power terrorism training exercise, and like this story about people being shot at Canary Wharf, and several other things as well, as to, whether these were stories that just kind of came out in the wash, or whether these were things that were sort of set up beforehand so that, people would have something to chase and something to kind of argue with each other about, and get distracted by. Because if you're looking in one direction, you can only look in that direction at any given time. So it's something to be wary of.
We're nearly out of time, but I was just wondering, you focus on 7/7 a lot and terrorism and stuff. Have you got any other plans, any other events you want to research? Have you ever considered like starting a podcast and looking at current affairs or anything like that? Anything else planned for the future?
I am in the process of building a website to sort of try and consolidate a lot of this stuff together. I don't know about podcasting. That maybe it's something I've considered, and it's something that's sort of on the back burner for future development. There are a few more videos in the pipeline. I'm planning a short video about 7/7 that is just a kind of punchy, introduction to all of these issues that would work, very differently to my feature-length films. There are plans afoot to make a documentary about the Muhammad Hamid case, and hopefully that will be developing very soon. Next year's big film project, I hope, will be one on double agents, and that will look at, not specific terrorist attacks necessarily, but look at a sort of historical patterns in the use of double agents, and see if I can shed some light on what's going on now that way. So yeah, there are more projects coming, very much so, and I'm kind of trying to expand the sphere of what I can look at properly all the time. But you know how it is. You can either go into a lot of detail with something, or you can cover lots and lots of different things and not go into that much detail with any of them. I mean, it's a balancing act.
Well, thanks, Tom. That pretty much wraps things up today. Everyone be sure to check out 7/7 Crime and Prejudice on the 7/7 Archive channel. But from me and Tom, that's it for this week. Thanks, Tom.
Good talking to you, Keelan.
Cheers. See ya.
If you found the preceding information valuable, please consider buying a DVD or making a small donation of your choosing. Go to wideshut.co.uk/donate. That's wideshut.co.uk/donate. You are the resistance.